Hi, I'm Mále. I am an architect, an artist and researcher, and one of the designers in residence at the Design Museum. I work transdisciplinary to create spatial narratives that can communicate ideas about material culture in art and architecture. The residency was a fantastic opportunity to initiate a long-term project about this, and my previous experience working with the philosophical ideas about new materialism and material agency, but this time with a very specific time and place and narrative, which is looking at salt in the Atacama Desert from the perspective of mining waste. So through materiality, this project made me look at different complexities. Firstly, rediscovering salt as a mundane material that we usually overlook, and rediscover it from its chemical, physical properties and possibilities. But also looking at it, at its many mineral compositions and geological processes, and particularly mining processes that it involves in the Atacama. So the project looked into a territorial scale of the broader complex issues surrounding the Atacama Desert territory as an extreme landscape of overlaying environmental, productive, and ancestral narratives. So as a research project, there were various outcomes. There was a film that was made in a research trip in the desert. There was a writing critical piece, and there was an exhibition as a multimedia installation that focused on the material processes of turning saline residues into a material that we could look at from a different perspective. And I did that by creating a more than 3 meters wall made out of 1,300 tiles of salt and plaster that created this geometric pattern and visual effects with the interaction with light, dragging the attention to the surface and making us question how we give value to materials. So working with specific territories that are vulnerable is an opportunity for artists and designers to use our work and reimagine these territories and the relationships that they establish with our global cities. And this is why today we're having an exciting session starting with a film screening of 3 different films that are looking at the territory of the Atacama in South America, created by multidisciplinary teams. We will start with a film called From Here We Go Extreme by Tom Berg. He's a musician and filmmaker who works with music video and documentary to develop languages of activism and thinking ecology. This film focuses in a community in the south region of Chile's Atacama that is experiencing rapid desertification. We will watch an extract from the film. It's a final scene where dancers dramatize the relationship between a father and his daughter following a previous scene that you can watch later in the full film, where the father describes his heartbreak as his daughter decides to move from her land. And this scene reflects upon the psychic shock of environmental transformation. We will then watch Nebula, Suspended Volume by Camanchaca Lab. They are a landscape laboratory by Mauricio Lacrampet, Sebastián Arriagada, and Felipe Cisternas from Chile. And the film focuses on the same landscape, but looking at the scarcest resource, which is water, but the one that is suspended in the air in the shape of the Camanchaca, which is this characteristic coastal fog in the Atacama that forms as a cloud in the Pacific Ocean and touches the coastal cliff and covers the landscape of Alto Patache, sustaining this rich network of multiple socio-ecological relationships. So Kamachakala went there on an expedition using light projecting artifacts to record visual information of the fall, using a section plane of light that unveils the traces of water droplets in motion, exposing its turbulence and physical materiality in these beautiful, stunning images. So this film is a reminder that sometimes the desert needs a closer look. And we will finalize with the breast milk of the volcano by Unknown Fields. This is a nomadic design research studio by Kate Davies and Liam Young. They venture out on expeditions to the ends of the world, alternative landscapes, alien landscapes, industrial ecologies, and they use film and animation to think of alternative futures. So this film focuses in the lithium evaporation ponds in Salar de Uyuni, in the Bolivian part of the Atacama. And the screening will be followed with a conversation with Kate Davies from Unknown Fields, which will be great so that we can discuss further this project in particular, the territory of the Atacama, but also the broader complexities about working with extreme landscapes from our creative fields, and why should be looking into these places right now. I hope you will enjoy this beautiful selection of films, and I'll see you later with Kate.
welcome everyone to basically the announcement of Tesla Energy. All right. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is about a fundamental transformation of how the world works, about how energy is delivered across Earth. This is how it is today. It's pretty bad. So that sucks, exactly. I just want to be clear because sometimes some people are like confused about this. This is real, okay? This is actually how most power in the world is generated with fossil fuels. And if you look at the curve, that's a famous curve, the Chilean curve, which shows the growth in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And every year it ratchets up. It gets higher and higher. And if we do nothing, that's where it's headed, to levels that we don't even see in the fossil record. So this is. Well, I think we collectively should do something about this, and not try to win the Darwin Award. So for us and a lot of other reasons too.
Here, on these ancient salt flats, sacred mountains stand guard over a landscape charged with electric potential. A new future awaits. This landscape is central to the culture and mythology of the indigenous Aymara people, and it's pregnant with billion-dollar prospects. This ethereal place is said to become the feeding ground of a global green energy revolution. The drive for small and powerful batteries has rendered this landscape one of the most sought after on Earth. Buried here is a grey gold called lithium, the power in our pockets. It's fundamental to the charging and recharging of millions of gleaming electronic devices, and it's the future of electric cars. Half the world's reserves lie dissolved in brine beneath this salt crust, untapped. And for the people of the Bolivian Altiplano, its extraction brings with it unanswered questions of land ownership, resource royalties, and environmental impacts. Many of the natural resources, so fundamental to our contemporary technologies, begin their lives in sacred landscapes like these. When we imagine the futures these technologies promise, we rarely acknowledge the cultural origins of the material contained within them. The landscapes from which they are forged are often spaces of deep significance to the people who call them home. What is the true creation story of our battery-powered future? Not the story typically pitched on a product launch stage or flashed through in a tech conference presentation. It's one woven together from all the wild and mysterious forces which have brought this future into being, from the Big Bang to the battery. It is as much a story of dancing llamas and weeping volcanoes as it is one of chemistry, physics, and geology. All of these things give shape to our world.
There was one red pixel. Okay, in the blue square was a red pixel. Now it's zoomed in so you can see that red pixel. That is the size of the batteries needed to transition all of the United States to being solar with batteries. Okay, it is a very tiny amount. Okay. 1 pixel, just remember that. 1 pixel is the size of the batteries needed for the United States to have no fossil fuel generated electricity. This is no room at all. So not a problem for solar or batteries. Now, the issue with existing batteries is that they suck, okay? They're really horrible. They look like that. They're expensive. They're unreliable. They're sort of stinky, ugly, bad in every way. Very expensive. You have to get some sort of, you need to combine multiple systems. There's not one integrated place you can go and buy a battery that just works, which is what people really want to buy. So we have to come up with a solution. That's the missing piece. That's the thing that's needed to have a proper transition to a sustainable energy world. So the missing piece is what we're going to show you tonight. All right.
This landscape remains, for now, a territory of possibility, caught between the values of an ancient past and the promise of a luminous tomorrow. But if the future is electric, then the future is here, lying in wait for the world.
What people really want to buy.
We are back after a screening of films around the extreme landscapes of the desert. For the ones joining just now, I am Mále, one of the designers in residence at the Design Museum, and we are in the session called Reimagining Extreme Landscapes, which started with the screening of a few films that ended with The Breast Milk of the Volcano by Unknown Fields. And I am now here with Kate Davies from Unknown Fields, and it is a big pleasure for me to be with you today. Kate is an artist, architect, and writer. She's the co-founder of the multidisciplinary group Liquid Factory and one of the leaders of Unknown Fields. And Kate teaches at the Architectural Association and UCL, and her work engages with how people inhabit and understand landscape, particularly those that are extreme and remote. And that's why it is really exciting to be discussing this panel here with you today. So hi, Kate.
Hi.
It would be great to hear a bit more about your relationship with extreme landscapes, and particularly about the project from the film we just watched.
Well, I mean, just talking about Unknown Fields, which I run together with Liam Young, what we're interested in, I suppose, is the relationship between landscapes that might seem remote or distant or kind of seemingly forgotten, and the everyday things that are actually very familiar or seemingly banal to us within urban environments usually. So we're interested in the constellation of spaces and places that actually coagulate, that come together to form a city, and that the material that is brought to the city has to come from somewhere, and that it's not a kind of dead material, but it is a part of a space and a place, and that space and place has deeper resonances to the people who live there, and it, as a kind of collection of matter in place. I think it's interesting to think about what we bring with us when we bring it to the city, if you like, in all its tiny pieces. The film that you just watched, the breast milk of the volcano, came about through an investigation of electric futures. So we were interested in Elon Musk's statements about electric cars and batteries and house batteries and so on. And so the question came up, well, where might this stuff come from? And looking into it, the biggest reserve of lithium, which is a major component in electric car batteries, and lithium ion batteries essentially, which are in everything from our phones to electric cars. It's going to be the kind of the way the future is powered until we find even more advanced battery technology. The biggest reserve of lithium occurs in the lithium triangle, which is between Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, with the supposedly biggest single reserve being under the Salar de Uyuni, the Great Salt Lake in Bolivia. So that's where the film started, to actually take an expedition there to meet a lot of people on the ground, to talk with local people, to visit the kind of the pilot plants for the lithium production, and to kind of understand what that materially meant, both in terms of its chemical processes and geological formation of the salt lake, but also in terms of the kind of the mythological resonances of that space, of that lake, which are quite incredible, actually.
Yeah, and it is interesting how through this research trip and your documentation, you've been revealing all these layers that coexist in this landscape. I think it's interesting to question, why are we looking into these extreme landscapes, and in many cases they work as these places that are out of the radar and in a state of abandonment. Actually, in Chile, in the desert, if you go on the road, you will find all sort of abandoned things, because it is a place where people just go and dump things that they don't want to be found again. And that's why illegal burning of textiles and objects happened there, and why even politic prisoners were buried in this landscape during the dictatorship and never found again. So it's an environment that carries a long history of violence and abandonments, and that's why it is so interesting to see how, as artists and designers and architects, we can start looking at them and paying attention again into these landscapes that are extreme in the literal sense of high temperatures and little living forms of life visible. But that are extreme mainly because of the logics and the ones we are operating them. And then there's this aspect of the ancestral that you just mentioned, which is key to fully understand what these extreme environments are, because a place like the Atacama Desert has been inhabited by people since the beginnings of time, and it's just now that they're being displaced and pushed away from their land. And there's such a big contrast between the way that original people inhabited and understood this landscape with how we do it now. And the Lican and Thai people in this territory, as all the indigenous communities in South America, they don't really see a division between culture and nature, and they have this holistic understanding of nature that is ruled by myths and narratives. So I wanted to ask you a bit more about that aspect that is so relevant in this project, the ancestral wisdom and the importance of the magic of the myth, and how could that be brought into a modern society?
Yeah, so I think that was something that really amazed us as well. Just probably not the right word, but it was something that really struck us on the expedition, and in talking to local people about the Salar de Uyuni and the creation of it, because it is a quite astonishing landscape. I mean, it's a tourist hotspot for a reason. You know, it's quite incredible. And so we were interested in the creation stories. Two creation stories, I suppose, make up the film. One from the point of view of, let's say, a kind of geological, modern understanding, a scientific understanding of the formation of lithium, from its formation in the Big Bang, which is, it was actually from, lithium was formed right at the beginning of the beginning, to the way that it becomes present in the Salar de Uyuni, which is through volcanic activity that brings it up from the Earth's crust, and then years of kind of meltwater pulls it down into the Salar de Uyuni. So I think this was really, really critical for us, because actually the local myth, the local mythology about that space is that the mother volcano, Tunapa, which is one of the volcanoes around the edge of the Salar de Uyuni. The story goes that she was jilted by her lover, and she, while breastfeeding her baby, she cried, and her tears and her breast milk mingled to form the Salar de Uyuni. And there's something really amazingly parallel about those two descriptions of how the Salar was formed from these volcanoes. So we were interested in storytelling being a more inclusive project, or a way of understanding complexity, but also a way of understanding that there are other points of view that actually ultimately come to maybe a similar truth, let's say. So that's where the film, that's how the film was structured, as trying to kind of blend these two origin stories and maybe slightly kind of confuse them at points, so that you start to question this kind of binary relationship between science and myth, and in the way that we kind of separate them, and we assign truth to science, to scientific narrative. And we're interested in the fact that stories and myth and folklore, traditional ways of telling tales, actually allow complexity within, and allow kind of subtlety and nuance in ways of knowing to be held within them. They're a kind of connective tissue that holds quite a lot of complexity in them. Whereas, our contemporary media narratives, maybe as an example, they don't hold complexity. They are very simplistic. So I suppose that's where storytelling is something that I find really compelling, and something that Liam and I are always trying to incorporate in our work in that way.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. That's I think it's a crucial part of our role as creatives, actually, to work with storytelling and creating these new imaginaries. And in the middle of an environmental crisis, that is very relevant. And I think it's interesting to see how, like, these parallels on how you're looking at this territory from the perspective of an electric materiality and an electric future. And in the work I developed with the Design Museum, I was looking at the same territory, also from materiality, but from this more like tactile materiality of salt and its diverse forms. And lithium is one of those shapes that salts and saline minerals can take. So I think it's really fascinating to see how, through these different ways of creating storytelling, we can have a second look at these materials and at these territories that shape them, and unveil the narratives behind it. And in the case of salt, it's something so ordinary, right? We have salt in our bodies, it's in the ocean, it's everywhere. And in the Atacama Desert is everywhere as well. And in the same way that you have lithium as this precious mineral right now, you also have the largest deposits of nitrate, which was really important in the saltpeter era, and it was the main connection of Chile with the rest of the world, and especially with Britain, who were importing all this nitrate as a fertilizer and also as explosives for World War II, until there was the invention of the synthetic the synthetic saltpeter, sorry. And with this new technology, there was a complete change of how we gave value to these materials. So it went from being the white gold into being something that no one even was interested in looking at. And all these productive industries and towns were abandoned again and left alone. And I think building this parallel is a very good way of understanding how materials and territories are cultural constructs, and they are shaped by the stories that we tell around them. And that's why it's so important to, while lithium is being a key component, it's so important to be looking at what are the narratives that we're looking at around it, and what's going to happen when we have the synthetic lithium or the next material. What will happen with these bases, right? It's quite terrifying.
Well, they call it grey gold.
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right. One of the drivers, obviously, for lithium-ion batteries is the fact that they can be very thin and very light, which means, it's not going to show up on my background. The width of that is a value that has become a kind of taken for granted signifier of something good, something desirable, as thin. And I think that what's interesting about that is we don't really appreciate the kind of incredible nature of lithium as a material, of its genesis in the Big Bang, of its incredible properties, of the phenomenal landscapes that it's found in. And so one of the kind of things that I'm really interested in about the film is its potential to, perhaps if we conceived of the bits and pieces inside something like a mobile phone or a laptop or these kind of ubiquitous technologies we take for granted, if we conceived of the things inside them like lithium, like gold, there's a lot of gold inside electronics, as things that came with a little piece of magic or a little piece of wonder, perhaps there's a potential for that to change the way that we think about them, to inherently change the way we think about throwing them away, not through guilt or a kind of sense of obligation, but through an understanding of wonder. And that was a question, a kind of broader question about the narratives of sustainability, the tone of them. Like, is guilt a way of inspiring people to change? I'm not sure. Are there other ways of kind of seeding ideas that are maybe more hopeful? So yeah, I think that there's something kind of we were also interested in this. Behind me, actually, this background is a lithium evaporation pool from a lithium mine, and it's kind of beautiful. It looks like a Caribbean beach or something. So with that film, we were also interested in the fact that this kind of mining didn't fit with our idea of a kind of disgusting kind of horror landscape of it's beautiful from the air. I mean, in the film you'll have seen the kind of aerial drone shots. It looks like a painting, and I think that something about the sublimity of that landscape, even when it's being mined, was interesting to us because it was a counter narrative to the kind of visual carnage that we're used to seeing alongside narratives of environmental narratives. So the question throughout our work is about what are the modes of communicating, what are the modes of storytelling that might unpack some of our cultural narratives around environmental issues in a counter way, in a way that just unlocks absurdity or puts things together that you weren't expecting. Because I think there's an apathy problem. And how do we deal with that? I think it's a kind of core question.
Yeah, and this links directly to the next point that I wanted to talk about, which is how these extreme territories and these narratives link to our practice and looking at art and design as investigative tools to unpick these issues, and what are the tools that we use to do that, and this idea of demystifying a little bit the role of the artist and the role of the designer as someone that is giving solutions to problems and creating tangible outcomes that have that can optimize our lives, and putting the attention on these narratives around them. So I know that you work a lot in this transdisciplinary way, and you use tools from architecture, from documentation. So I think it would be interesting to hear a bit more about how that works, and what's the place of the research trip, and how that relates into the creation of these objects through fiction, for example.
Yeah, I mean, so my background is architecture, and I would say that kind of, and Liam's as well, and we both teach and lecture in architecture. And I think that the themes and the way that we approach the work is definitely comes from that background. But the tools that we deploy would be seen more as tools of an artist. Maybe because they're more immediate. Architecture takes a long time. But also I think I'm personally interested in not so much the solution, but actually fleshing out the problem a bit more. Or enabling, like how might we enable the full spectrum of the design, let's call it a problem, but the design brief, how might you actually open that out so we're actually trying to look at all of its complexity. So when we're designing for instance, if whatever you're designing for a specific site or a specific object, if it's product design, or we have a tendency as designers to only look at the issue as far as the brief of the client, and there's a kind of, we stop there. And I think that if designers and especially kind of young designers and design students are incredibly talented, creative, adaptable, agile people. I personally feel that if we can give people the full scope of the issue, then we'll go a long way to making steps to actually be more intelligent about the things that we design for that, let's say. That's kind of where I would say we're trying to situate the work is in the stories we tell about things, we say is like in the site of the things that we take for granted, that is a site of operation, the site of collective narratives, the site of collective imagination. That actually, that for me is not, rather mere kind of, I think it gets quite often, the criticism is that it's irrelevant, or that you're highlighting the problem but not proposing any solutions, la la la. I've heard it all. But I think that surely the kind of site of our collective understanding of the world, or our collective imagination, and that as a force, is actually an incredibly powerful site. And I think on that note, we do consciously try with our work, whether it's successful or not, to try and make it accessible, not to make it too opaque, not to make it just for audiences that are kind of within their own frames of reference. Architecture is one of those. It can kind of be very hermetic. Architects talk to each other, and art in a similar way. And I think that if it can straddle between kind of contemporary forms of public discourse and a widespread media and art or architecture, then I think that we're in a much better position to kind of draw other audiences in, let's say. So in terms of the expeditions, we're very conscious not to do our work by Google. I think it's very easy to think that Google and Google Earth will represent somewhere, but they're really only a kind of strange reflection. And it's very important that we go, and we set up a whole suite of meetings, and it's very important that we go with an open mind and without a kind of framed project in mind. Quite often we take groups of collaborators and groups of students with us, and it becomes a kind of big rolling bus of conversations, which really helps as well. So it's a way of trying to understand also, because we're coming from a very different culture. There's a real danger that you go there and you make assumptions about somewhere, and so that, you know, it's all, those are all parts of the things that we're kind of aware of when we're making and planning the expeditions, I suppose. And then the other thing is to go with the equipment to visualize these places seductively. And I say that absolutely honestly, because it's really important for us that our work is seductive, because I think that's part of the way that you start to communicate with people and draw them in. So the drones and the, you know, a film crew and proper equipment and sound recording equipment, etc.
That's a really crucial point about the action and purpose of how art and design and architecture engages with these extreme territories. And in relation to the expedition, for me, for example, because I am from Chile, and my sister lives in the desert, so I do have a relationship with the desert, but I'm still an outsider. So even for me, going there was crucial to truly understand what it means to be there and what are these narratives, and be very respectful with it. And I think that it's fascinating how the expedition gave shape to the project in the same way that you were saying. I started by finding these salt rock formations that were absolutely alien. They were beautiful. And I just got obsessed with understanding how they get shape only through geological processes and wind and temperature with no human interaction. And that's how it all started. And then within the frame of the design museum, I went back on an expedition to look at the desert through the lens of salt. And that gave shape to this final installation. And in relation to what you were saying of how it is about making these narratives relatable and making them accessible for the audience, that's a really crucial point as well. And I worked with documentation, but the final piece in this work, Salt Imaginaries, was an exhibition at the Design Museum. All these elements, all these scenographic elements were playing a role on giving different ways to the audience to engage with the narrative, and ultimately, if someone didn't want to read the essay and didn't want to engage with the huge amount of research that we can gather in these kind of works, they would get the experience of looking at salt as a precious material that can look beautiful in an unexpected way, like a building material, which is something that actually happens in the desert. It's so abundant that people use it to build architectural structures. So in that way, I think that's a really important thing on how through these different tools we can use art and design to communicate these ideas. And the word of seduction that you were saying is, that's why it's so important, and that's why I also tried to make this exhibition and the installation as a place that you really wanted to come in and be immersed, because it is also about telling these narratives from a constructive point of view, and about like questioning what is the design criteria, because as artists and designers we can select what are the stories that we're working with, and in that way we're directing the attention to a new place. So I wanted to also make a little parallel, because in your work you've been looking at other extreme landscapes as well. In that sense, extreme can mean many things. So as we were saying, the desert is extreme because it's really dry, it's remote, but it's also because it is ruled by these dynamics that are quite violent, and that work under the logics of exploitation, and that are actually carried from very old imperialist and colonialist practices that can also be replicated in other landscapes that you have been visiting that are related with this idea of the behind the city. So I wanted to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of a range of landscapes that we go to. I think that it's interesting. They're only extreme if you don't live there, I think, so a lot of the time. I mean, we called our practice Unknown Fields, and I always remember one of our trips to Australia. We've done a couple of projects in Australia, and one of the geologists there saying, "They're only unknown to you, mate." You know, we know them quite well, and you know, I think this is also what kind of one of the points that I suppose we're interested in playing with or exploring in the work, is that you know, the attitude that's somewhere that seems strange or empty to you because of the context of your life, and you know, the terra nullius argument, which has been there for centuries, been there, you know, it's a kind of colonial legacy. I think that still exists in a huge force. There's the ice cream van again. And so to kind of try and scratch the surface of that, I think is really important. Some of the other places we've looked at, I suppose they range from seemingly, I say seemingly natural or wild landscapes, to manufacturing landscapes. So landscapes of production, like manufacturing, like factories in China. We've recently made a film in India looking at the textile production supply chain. So it's a kind of procession through all the spaces that, all the factory spaces that contribute to fast fashion. So you'll get a kind of pink t-shirt. There's a whole series of spaces that create that. And so we wanted to kind of look at all those spaces in a film. We've looked at places like Alaska. That was a slightly kind of more intangible sense of place. I suppose we were looking at the data that creates our kind of climate change narratives and arguments, and how that data is crunched in huge supercomputers, one of which being in Fairbanks, Alaska, and the relationship between that kind of data landscape and the real landscape of ice, and the people who live there, and their sense of change through observation, and the difference between, you know, the difference between the two modes of observation, I suppose we were interested in. So it's kind of a range between what you would think of as a kind of natural landscape, and like the one that's behind you, perhaps now,
Yeah.
and landscapes that are inherently infrastructural, so cargo ships, factories, mines, all those kinds of spaces we see as a series of contributing spaces to the are familiar. And what we're interested in is that kind of sticking that together. So the mine that sits on the side of your bedside table next to your alarm clock, you know, these objects that come from very seemingly strange places, or we'd say extreme places, actually exist in our pockets. They're in our wardrobes, they're in, you know, on our shelves at home. They exist in our world in a kind of the most ordinary, banal way on the Tesco supermarket shelf. So how to put those two things together, I think, is a kind of interesting to me anyway.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating to see these relationships between global cities and the territories that are feeding them and sustaining them under these traces of production that you were mentioning that are completely lost in the way, and we don't even see because we actually don't want to see. And that is why looking at mining waste is really important, because it is a way of looking into the materials and the material production industries that come from these extreme landscapes through extractive practices, from the perspective of all the materials that were left behind, the ones that have no value and that are literally piling up. So in the Atacama Desert in Chile, for example, you have more than 700 tailings which are reshaping the landscape. Some of them are active, some are not, some are toxic. And that's why when looking into salt, I looked at it from the perspective of waste. Salt is already something that we give little value because it is ordinary and it is everywhere. Then in the mining saline minerals in the desert, there are kinds of salts that have even less value. Because they are residues. So in the evaporation of lithium, for example, there are different kinds of salts that are produced as secondary salts, and their value is so small that there's nothing to do with them that would give any kind of economical value, and they are just piling up and creating their own wide landscape of salt residues. And the same happens with copper and other metals in a way more dramatic way, because that waste is really toxic and is affecting the communities that live there, which is really dramatic, in the same way that lithium is using all the water resources. So, and that's why rethinking the value of these minerals that have been disregarded and left alone, aside and forgotten is important, and it requires a holistic view. Sometimes deconstruct a little bit this general obsession that we also have with discovering new material technologies and biomaterials, which are great, but we need to work them from this narrative and critical standpoint of why are we producing these materials and what are the processes that they will leave behind.
It's interesting about that, actually, because I was thinking about this recently. The discovery of new materials, the discovery of new properties comes from a space of wonder, by the most part, of absolute obsession from scientists and material scientists and so on, and so it's a kind of a, I see it as a kind of quest of a love for the fascinating materiality of our planet, let's say. So for me, that I think that's it, what's interesting is where that gets lost, where the material becomes buried and made banal and made ordinary and made let's say a right, you know, where it becomes, okay, well, we can just have that, we can have as much as we want. And I think that there's a really interesting space between those two things, that maybe if we could carry through some of that, some of the amazing wonder and surprise of discovery which happens in labs, through to the shelves.
And I think I wanted to maybe wrap up some of these ideas by jumping into how all the way we're working with these extreme landscapes and addressing the problematics of materiality, how it has been really relevant for a long time, but how it becomes even more urgent at the moment in the context of a global crisis that is so multi-layered and complex. We are already in an environmental crisis, but now we're facing a health crisis that triggered an economical one and a humanitarian one. And we've been working under complete new parameters of normality that have allowed us to reflect on some things. And that's why some movements have risen up about discrimination. So I think there are some intersectional relationships in the way we treat these landscapes that are vulnerable, and the way we treat groups of people in society, and how the forces that operate these landscapes are the same old colonialist dynamics that rule our forms of violence and discrimination in our society. I don't know, what's your vision around that?
I think, yeah, wow. I mean, it's been an incredible period of reflection. One of the things I think that's become apparent is a real focus on or a real appreciation for the local. That was kind of forced in a lot of ways, whether that's your neighborhood or having to make things at home because you can't buy them. But also an idea of distance. I think the distance between, say, a space of production and the city has always been erased, in the way that the materiality of something like kind of the great big server farms, the material itself that needs to be created to store electricity, all those kinds of things are also erased. So there's a real erasure of both the material and the geographic, the distances that things have to travel across the ocean, for example. And that, I think that comes about because we're somehow within the kind of economic framework we've set up as a culture, that those things are really cheap. Or let's talk about the travel. That shipping goods from one space to another is outrageously cheap for what it is. And I think that perhaps there may come a kind of reevaluation of that. And because the value systems, because oil is cheap, and relative to its environmental impact and relative to the other problems that a kind of global scale of manufacturing cause, these things are not factored into a kind of a value equation, if you like. They're erased from it. And I think that what hopefully a potential for is to try and pull in some other kinds of values that would be set against, set a kind of new metric for how we evaluate the cost of things, and that cost being incorporating environmental costs in a real way, not in a kind of carbon offsetting, greenwashing way, societal costs, all the kinds of things that are invisible and intangible now. I would hope that might be some kind of potential to come out of this.
In relationship with the environmental crisis and the current global crisis, I was also thinking, I was reading the other day the term of environmental racism, which was quite interesting, and it addresses the ways in which waste and pollution and the way we treat these extreme landscapes affects not directly the global cities at first, but is actually affecting the most vulnerable people and the people inhabiting those landscapes. So there is a racial segregation in place, and all these bad regulations and the exploitation of these landscapes is affecting indigenous peoples who are the ones that have been there forever. And I think that attitude that we see in places like the Atacama Desert are really urgent, and we need to look at them, and it's just easier to forget them because, again, they are remote and they are far away and unknown for most of people. And we have multiple forms of violence in place now in our societies, in global cities and everywhere. But I think it is important for us, I guess, to look at these unknown places so that we can bring those narratives.
Yeah, I think, and just to acknowledge the shadows, and we call them the shadows that the city casts.
Yeah.
I think the world is a lot more knowable now than it was. So I think that's a positive thing. I think there are a lot more ways of visualizing and understanding and sensing and mapping and collecting data about the world that can inform an understanding of the impacts of certain things on other things, which perhaps wasn't there before. And I think that there's a potential there to use that to make more informed decisions about things.
Yeah, definitely. That's
so
why
I end on a note of hope.
Yes. And that's exactly why we watch the films today, because they're all showing these realities in different ways under new models of perception, and that hopefully can help us have a new look at them, and also rethink how we use our practice and the tools that we have available to engage with things that matter to us and they're different to all of us. Thank you, Kate. This has been a really
Thank you, Mále.
Good conversation. I'm a big admirer of your work with Liam, and I hope that we can keep looking at extreme landscapes as ones that are full of stories to be told.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
And thank you so much, and thank you to the Virtual Design Festival for having us today with the Design Museum.